I'm 32 years old, a dental hygienist living in Fort Collins, Colorado. For years, my life was small but comfortable. I rented a little townhouse, drove an 8-year-old Honda, spent Sundays with my parents, and had a close relationship with my older brother, Daniel. At least I thought we were close. My parents had owned a modest 2-story house for almost 30 years. It wasn't fancy, but it was the only place that had ever felt permanent to me. I grew up there. My mother taught me how to bake in that kitchen. My father measured my height against the hallway wall every birthday. When my mother died, my father became quieter. I started visiting him almost every evening after work. My brother didn't. Daniel lived about 40 minutes away and had a busy construction business. He always had an excuse. I'm just slammed right now, Tess. You understand how much work I have. Take care of Dad for me, okay? And I did. I bought groceries. I drove Dad to appointments. I paid bills when he forgot. I even spent nearly 3 months helping him recover after he fell in the backyard. I never thought of it as a sacrifice. He was my father. Then one cold November evening, everything changed. I came home from work and found my father sitting at my kitchen table. Daniel was beside him. Neither of them looked at me. Dad finally said, "Tessa, you need to pack a few things." I laughed because I honestly thought it was a joke. "Pack for what?" Daniel looked at my father, then he looked at me. "You can't stay here anymore." Remember staring at him for several seconds. "Stay where?" "In Dad's house." My stomach dropped. I had been staying there temporarily because Dad needed help recovering, but I had also been paying the utilities, buying food, and sleeping in the guest room. I thought Dad wanted me here. My father wouldn't look at me. Daniel placed a folder on the table. "We've decided it's better if you move out." "Who's we?" Silence. Then my father whispered, "Daniel is handling my affairs now." That sentence hurt more than anything else. I looked at my father. "Dad, did I do something?" He finally raised his eyes. "Been controlling too much." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Been helping you," Daniel interrupted. "That's exactly the problem. You made yourself indispensable." I felt something inside me crack. I packed 2 suitcases that night. My father didn't stop me, neither did Daniel. I drove back to my townhouse crying so hard I had to pull over twice. For the next few weeks I kept asking myself the same question. What had I done wrong? Then the strange things started. A credit card I had helped my father open was suddenly cancelled. A utility account I had been paying disappeared from my name. And one afternoon I received a letter from an attorney saying I had been accused of taking money from my father's account. I nearly dropped the letter. I called Daniel. "What is this?" His voice was cold. "You should probably talk to your lawyer." "I don't have a lawyer." "Then get one." He hung up. That was the moment I stopped crying. I realized they weren't simply pushing me out. They were building a story about me. A story where I was the greedy daughter who had taken advantage of an elderly father. And Daniel was the responsible son who had supposedly saved him. I hired an attorney named Rebecca Collins. She didn't promise me anything. She simply said, "Before we do anything, we're going to find out exactly what happened." That sentence gave me something I hadn't felt in months: control. I gathered every receipt I had, every bank statement, every text message, every medical appointment, every grocery receipt, every payment I'd made for my father. I even found old text messages from Daniel asking me to pay certain bills because he was short until Friday. Rebecca noticed something strange. "These accusations started right after your brother took control of your father's finances. Then we need to see what changed. For months I did nothing dramatic. I went to work, I saved money, I rebuilt my life. I moved into a small apartment closer to my dental office. I started running in the mornings. I stopped calling my father. That was the hardest part. But I knew if I kept begging him to believe me, I'd remain trapped in the same emotional place. So I quietly moved forward. 2 years passed, then 3. By the 4th year I had become someone I barely recognized. I wasn't rich. I hadn't suddenly become famous. I was simply stronger. I became a supervisor at the dental clinic and eventually started taking evening classes in healthcare administration. I bought a small house with a modest mortgage. For the first time I had a life that didn't depend on whether my family approved of me. Then, 5 years after I was kicked out, I received an invitation. My father was selling his house. Daniel was hosting a family gathering before the sale. I almost threw the invitation away. Instead I went. When I walked through that front door, nobody recognized me at first. I had cut my hair shorter. I wore a simple navy dress and carried a leather folder. Daniel stared at me. "Tessa," I smiled. "Hi, Daniel." He looked genuinely uncomfortable. My father came out of the kitchen. He stared at me for a long moment, then his face changed. "Tessa," I nodded. He hugged me. I stood there stiffly. I wanted to forgive him, But forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. Daniel pulled me aside. You look good. Thanks, things have changed. I know, he lowered his voice. I think we should put the past behind us. I looked at him. I agree. His shoulders relaxed, then I added, that's why I brought these. I opened my folder. His expression changed immediately. Inside were copies of bank records, emails, signed documents, and correspondence collected over 5 years. Daniel's face went pale. What is this? Your story? He flipped through the pages, then stopped. One document showed a transfer from my father's account to Daniel's construction company. Another showed that the transfer had been described as a loan. But there was no loan agreement, no repayment schedule, nothing. I turned to my father. Dad, did you know Daniel borrowed almost $87,000 from you? My father's hands started shaking. Daniel immediately said, that's not what happened. Because the real twist was he had begun questioning where his money was going. Daniel needed someone else to blame, and I was the easiest target. But there was more. The attorney my father had hired during those first accusations had kept copies of every document. Rebecca eventually obtained them through the proper legal process. One email from Daniel to that attorney contained a sentence that changed everything. Look guilty because she's the one handling everything. He had planned the accusation before I even knew there was a problem. My father read the email twice, then he looked at Daniel. Did you do this? Daniel's voice cracked. Dad, I was trying to protect the family. What? Daniel had no answer. The house sale was postponed. An independent financial review was ordered. The review uncovered several questionable transfers from my father's accounts. Daniel eventually had to repay a significant portion of the money and face the consequences of the financial misconduct. I didn't receive some giant fortune. I didn't destroy him. I didn't need to. His own decisions had finally caught up with him. My father and I had a long conversation that night. He cried. So did I. I'm sorry, he said. I looked at the man who had once measured my height against the hallway wall. I needed you to believe me. I should have, I whispered. You should have. We didn't magically become the family we used to be. Real life doesn't work that way. Trust takes years to build and sometimes only minutes to destroy. But my father and I slowly began talking again. As for Daniel, I haven't spoken to him in years, and honestly, I don't feel angry anymore. 5 years earlier, they had kicked me out believing I had nothing. They were wrong. I had my skills, my work, my dignity, my memories. And most importantly, I still had the ability to rebuild. When I left that house the second time, I didn't feel like the rejected daughter anymore. I felt free. I used to think revenge meant making someone hurt the way they made you hurt. Now I understand something different. The strongest revenge isn't watching someone lose everything. It's becoming so secure in who you are that the people who once controlled your life no longer have any power over you. They kicked me out with nothing. 5 years later, they couldn't recognize me. And maybe that was the greatest victory of all. Because I didn't become someone they couldn't recognize. I became someone I finally recognized myself. manufacturing company in Columbus, Ohio. I live in a small townhouse with my 6-year-old daughter, Lily, and for most of my adult life, I thought being dependable was the same thing as being valued. I was the woman everyone called when they needed help. I covered shifts, I lent money, I organized family dinners, I remembered birthdays, I showed up when other people disappeared. And somehow that became my weakness. The people closest to me had gotten so used to seeing me as the quiet one that they forgot quiet people can still keep records. They forgot quiet people can still learn. And most importantly, they forgot quiet people eventually get tired of being laughed at. It started with my younger brother, Caleb. Caleb was 30 years old and had always been the charming one in our family. He owned a small landscaping company with his wife, Marissa. They were constantly talking about expansion, new equipment, bigger contracts, and the life they were supposedly building. I was proud of him. When his business needed help with payroll and bookkeeping, I spent several weekends showing him how to organize invoices, track employee hours, and separate business expenses from personal spending. I didn't charge him. He was my brother. That was my mistake. My parents adored Caleb. They saw him as the ambitious son who was going places. I was the practical daughter. The boring one. The one with spreadsheets. At family dinners, Caleb would sometimes joke about me. "Careful, everybody," he'd say. "Tessa's about to audit the potato salad." Everyone would laugh. Even me. I didn't want to be sensitive. But the jokes gradually changed. One night my father looked at me across the table and said, "You know, Tessa, you worry too much. Caleb has vision, you should learn from him." I smiled. Maybe I should. Caleb grinned. "That's the smartest thing you've said all night." Everyone laughed again. I laughed too. But something inside me stopped laughing. A few weeks later, Caleb asked me for a favor. He wanted to buy 2 commercial-grade trucks and some landscaping equipment. The bank required additional financial documentation because his company was still relatively young. He asked me to help prepare the paperwork. I agreed. For several nights, I worked after Lily went to sleep. That's when I noticed something strange. Several payments had been made from the company account to an account I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was a vendor. Then I looked closer. The account belonged to a company called Whitmore Property Services. That was our father's middle name and our grandfather's last name. I asked Caleb about it. He barely looked up from his phone. "Just a supplier." "What supplier? Why does it matter?" "Because the payment description doesn't match the invoice." He sighed. "Tessa, you're helping me with paperwork, not running the company." I stared at him. "Okay." He smiled. "See, that's better." I let it go. At least that's what he thought. A month later, my parents invited me to dinner. I expected another family gathering. Instead, Caleb was there with Marissa. My father cleared his throat. "We've decided to make some changes regarding the family property." I immediately knew which property he meant. My grandfather had owned a small commercial building on the east side of Columbus. After he died, my father inherited it. The building wasn't glamorous, but it generated rental income from several small businesses. My grandfather had always told me, "One day that building will help you and your brother." I had never asked for it. But I remembered his words. My father slid a folder across the table. "Caleb is taking over the property." I looked at him. "Taking over?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because he's building a business. You have a stable job." I felt something cold move through me. Did Grandpa change his will? My mother immediately said, "Don't make this difficult." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "You always make everything so dramatic." I opened the folder. There was a document claiming my grandfather had transferred his interest in the property years before his death. I stared at the signature. It looked like his. But something was wrong. My grandfather had suffered from severe arthritis in his final years. His signature had become shaky and uneven. This one was remarkably clean. I looked at Caleb. Where did this come from? He laughed. Seriously. My father shook his head. You're acting like Caleb stole something from you. I didn't say that. You don't have to, Caleb said. Then Marissa laughed. And my mother joined her. Within seconds, everyone at the table was laughing. I sat there completely still. My father finally said, Tessa, stop acting entitled. You didn't build that property. I stood up. I never said I did. Then what do you want? I looked at my family. For once I want the truth. Caleb smiled. You know what your problem is. You think being careful makes you smarter than everyone else. I picked up my purse. No. I looked directly at him. I think you made the mistake of assuming I wasn't paying attention. That was the last thing I said before leaving. That night, I cried in my car for almost 20 minutes before I could drive home. I felt humiliated, angry, completely alone. But underneath all of it was something stronger. Doubt. I couldn't prove Caleb had done anything wrong. Not yet. So I stopped talking. I stopped accusing. And I started checking. Because of my payroll job, I was comfortable working with financial records. I knew how to spot inconsistencies. I reviewed every document Caleb had previously sent me. I compared dates, names, addresses, account numbers, invoice numbers. Then I found something. The company listed as the supposed buyer of the property had been registered only 8 months before the document claiming my grandfather transferred the property. That didn't make sense. I searched public property records and discovered another detail. The transfer document had been recorded almost 2 years after my grandfather's death. My hands started shaking. I didn't confront Caleb. Instead, I contacted a real estate attorney and showed her the documents. She told me not to make accusations yet. Preserve everything, she said. Don't alter anything, don't warn them. So I listened. I gathered copies of the property records, business filings, bank statements I had legitimately received while helping Caleb, and emails he had sent me. Then I noticed the name of the registered agent for Whitmore Property Services. It was Marissa's brother. That company wasn't a supplier. It was a shell company connected to Caleb's family. But the biggest discovery came 3 days later. I found an old email from Caleb. It had been sent to Marissa's brother months before my grandfather died. The subject line was simple: property transfer. I opened it. Caleb had written that they needed to get everything organized before Dad changes his mind. My heart stopped. My grandfather hadn't agreed to anything. They had been planning around him. And there was one sentence at the bottom that changed everything. Once the building is transferred, Tessa won't have any reason to question the numbers. I read that line 3 times. They hadn't just underestimated me. They had counted on me being too trusting to investigate. My attorney helped me file the appropriate objections and gather the evidence for a formal review. I didn't threaten Caleb. I didn't post anything online. I didn't tell the whole family. I waited. Then about 6 weeks later, Caleb called me. His voice was different. Can we talk? We're talking. No, in person. Why? There was a long silence. Something happened with the property. I almost smiled. What happened? The transfer is being challenged. I know. He went quiet. You knew. I knew enough. He started breathing heavily. Tessa, listen to me. We can work this out. Work what out? Everything. I heard Marissa in the background. Tell her we are sorry. That was the first time I heard fear in their voices. A week later, the truth finally came out during the legal review. The signature on the transfer document had not been authenticated. The notary information was inconsistent. The supposed transfer date didn't match the public filing history. And the shell company connected to Marissa's brother had received money from Caleb's business shortly before the property documents were prepared. But then came the twist I never expected. My father had known about the transfer plan. He had not created the documents, but he had allowed Caleb to believe the plan was legitimate because he wanted the property to stay within the family business. When investigators questioned him, he admitted that my grandfather had never actually signed the final transfer. My father had been afraid of losing Caleb's business, so he had chosen to protect the son he thought needed him most. That confession broke something inside me. Not because I was surprised, because I finally understood. All those years I thought my family didn't see my value. The truth was worse. They saw it. They just assumed I would never demand that they respect it. The property transfer was stopped, and Caleb's business faced serious financial and legal consequences from the records that had been uncovered. I never had to destroy him. His own decisions did that. Months later, my father came to my townhouse. He looked older, smaller. He stood on my porch holding his hat in both hands. "Tessa," he said quietly, "I was wrong." I didn't answer immediately. He swallowed. "I should have protected you." I looked at him. "You should have respected me." His eyes filled with tears. "I know." Behind him, Caleb was sitting in the car. He eventually came inside. For the first time in my life, my brother didn't make a joke. He looked at me and said, "I'm sorry." I believed that he was sorry. But forgiveness didn't mean giving him another chance to control my life. I told him that. He nodded. And then he said something I'll never forget. "I thought you'd always need us." I shook my head. "That was your biggest mistake. I didn't become rich after everything happened. I didn't suddenly become powerful. I didn't need to. I kept my job. I raised Lily. I rebuilt my relationship with my parents slowly, with boundaries that hadn't existed before. And I stopped confusing being useful with being loved. For years, my family laughed because they thought I was the weak one. They laughed when I questioned things. They laughed when I asked for proof. They laughed when I refused to sign documents I didn't understand. Then one day, the same people who laughed at me were sitting across from me, asking me for mercy. I gave them something better than revenge. I gave them the truth. Because sometimes the strongest response isn't making people suffer the way they made you suffer. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let them control what happens next. I used to think being underestimated was an insult. Now I see it differently. Being underestimated gave me something dangerous. Time. While everyone else was laughing, I was learning. And when the laughter stopped, I was ready. My name is Tessa Whitmore. I'm 32 years old, and I work as a payroll specialist for a mid-sized manufacturing company in Columbus, Ohio. I live in a small townhouse with my 6-year-old daughter, Lily, and for most of my adult life, I thought being dependable was the same thing as being valued. I was the woman everyone called when they needed help. I covered shifts, I lent money, I organized family dinners, I remembered birthdays, I showed up when other people disappeared. And somehow that became my weakness. The people closest to me had gotten so used to seeing me as the quiet one that they forgot quiet people can still keep records. They forgot quiet people can still learn. And most importantly, they forgot quiet people eventually get tired of being laughed at. It started with my younger brother, Caleb. Caleb was 30 years old and had always been the charming one in our family. He owned a small landscaping company with his wife, Marissa. They were constantly talking about expansion, new equipment, bigger contracts, and the life they were supposedly building. I was proud of him. When his business needed help with payroll and bookkeeping, I spent several weekends showing him how to organize invoices, track employee hours, and separate business expenses from personal spending. I didn't charge him. He was my brother. That was my mistake. My parents adored Caleb. They saw him as the ambitious son who was going places. I was the practical daughter. The boring one. The one with spreadsheets. At family dinners, Caleb would sometimes joke about me. "Careful, everybody," he'd say. "Tessa's about to audit the potato salad." Everyone would laugh. Even me. I didn't want to be sensitive. But the jokes gradually changed. One night my father looked at me across the table and said, "You know, Tessa, you worry too much. Caleb has vision, you should learn from him." I smiled. Maybe I should. Caleb grinned. "That's the smartest thing you've said all night." Everyone laughed again. I laughed too. But something inside me stopped laughing. A few weeks later, Caleb asked me for a favor. He wanted to buy 2 commercial-grade trucks and some landscaping equipment. The bank required additional financial documentation because his company was still relatively young. He asked me to help prepare the paperwork. I agreed. For several nights, I worked after Lily went to sleep. That's when I noticed something strange. Several payments had been made from the company account to an account I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was a vendor. Then I looked closer. The account belonged to a company called Whitmore Property Services. That was our father's middle name and our grandfather's last name. I asked Caleb about it. He barely looked up from his phone. "Just a supplier." "What supplier? Why does it matter?" "Because the payment description doesn't match the invoice." He sighed. "Tessa, you're helping me with paperwork, not running the company." I stared at him. "Okay." He smiled. "See, that's better." I let it go. At least that's what he thought. A month later, my parents invited me to dinner. I expected another family gathering. Instead, Caleb was there with Marissa. My father cleared his throat. "We've decided to make some changes regarding the family property." I immediately knew which property he meant. My grandfather had owned a small commercial building on the east side of Columbus. After he died, my father inherited it. The building wasn't glamorous, but it generated rental income from several small businesses. My grandfather had always told me, "One day that building will help you and your brother." I had never asked for it. But I remembered his words. My father slid a folder across the table. "Caleb is taking over the property." I looked at him. "Taking over?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because he's building a business. You have a stable job." I felt something cold move through me. Did Grandpa change his will? My mother immediately said, "Don't make this difficult." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "You always make everything so dramatic." I opened the folder. There was a document claiming my grandfather had transferred his interest in the property years before his death. I stared at the signature. It looked like his. But something was wrong. My grandfather had suffered from severe arthritis in his final years. His signature had become shaky and uneven. This one was remarkably clean. I looked at Caleb. Where did this come from? He laughed. Seriously. My father shook his head. You're acting like Caleb stole something from you. I didn't say that. Neil Harper. I'm 34 years old, a payroll specialist living in Columbus, Ohio, and for most of my adult life, I was the quiet one in my family. I wasn't the most successful person at family gatherings. I didn't drive an expensive car or own a huge house. I lived in a small 2-bedroom townhouse with my husband, Daniel, and our 8-year-old daughter, Sophie. I worked hard, paid my bills, and tried to keep everyone around me happy. That last part was my biggest mistake, because the people I spent years trying to impress eventually became the same people who laughed when my life fell apart, and they laughed loudly. My problems started with something that seemed almost harmless. My older sister Vanessa had always been the star of our family. She owned a boutique clothing store downtown and constantly talked about expansion, investments, and how successful she was becoming. My younger brother, Kyle, worked for her. I was the boring sister, at least that's how they saw me. Whenever I mentioned my work, Vanessa would smile and say, "Peril, Camille, you could do something bigger than that." Kyle would laugh, even Daniel sometimes joined in. "She's happy counting other people's paychecks." He joked one Sunday at dinner. Everyone laughed, I laughed too. But inside it hurt. I had always believed that family teasing was harmless. Then Vanessa called me one evening and asked for help. Her boutique had grown quickly, and she was struggling with payroll and bookkeeping. She knew I had experience, so she asked me to review her employee records and help organize her finances. I agreed immediately. I didn't ask for much money. I thought I was helping my sister. For 3 months, I spent my evenings reviewing invoices, payroll reports, vendor payments, and bank statements. That's when I noticed something strange. Several payments were being made to a consulting company I had never heard of. The company was called Northfield Solutions. The invoices looked legitimate at first, but there was something odd. The business address was a mailbox. The phone number went straight to voicemail, and the amounts were almost identical every month. I mentioned it to Vanessa. She barely looked up from her phone. "It's a business expense." "Do you know who owns the company?" She rolled her eyes. "Camille, not everything is a conspiracy." Kyle laughed from across the room. "She's watching too many crime documentaries." I smiled awkwardly. "I'm just saying we should verify it." Vanessa leaned back. "You know what your problem is? You always think you're smarter than everyone else." That sentence stayed with me, because I wasn't trying to be smarter, I was trying to protect my sister. A few weeks later, Vanessa announced that she was opening a second store. Everyone celebrated. There was champagne, expensive food, and speeches about how proud the family was. Then Vanessa stood up. She raised her glass and said, "To proving that dreams come true when you actually have ambition." Applauded. Then she looked directly at me. "Some people should take notes." People laughed. I forced a smile. That night I went home and cried in my bathroom, not because of the joke, because I finally realized they weren't joking anymore. They genuinely believed I was beneath them. But I still didn't know what was coming. 2 months later, Vanessa accused me of stealing money. She called me into her office on a Monday morning. Kyle was sitting beside her. Daniel was there too. My stomach tightened. Vanessa placed a folder on the desk. "You're going to explain this?" I opened it. There were several transfers from the boutique's operating account. They were listed as payroll adjustments. My name appeared beside them. I stared at the pages. "I didn't do this." Kyle laughed. "Of course you didn't." I looked at Daniel. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Vanessa pushed another document toward me. Login was used. Heart dropped. Someone had accessed the payroll system using my credentials. But I hadn't done it. I explained everything. The strange consulting company, the suspicious invoices, the unusual transfers. Vanessa just stared at me. Then she said something I'll never forget. "Do you really think anyone is going to believe you?" I couldn't speak. She continued. "You've been handling our payroll for months. You had access to everything." Kyle smiled. "You really picked the wrong family to steal from." I realized then that this wasn't an accusation. It was a setup. They had already decided I was guilty, and somehow Daniel had decided to stand with them. That night he told me he thought I should confess. I looked at him like he was a stranger. "You actually believe I stole from my sister?" He sighed. "I don't know what to believe." "My husband." "I know." "No. You don't." Didn't answer. 3 days later, Vanessa filed a formal complaint against me. My employer also suspended me after Vanessa contacted them and accused me of financial misconduct. Within 1 week, I had lost my job, my family, and almost all of my confidence. People in our neighborhood started whispering. My parents stopped calling. Vanessa told relatives that I had always been jealous of her success. And the worst part, everyone believed her. One evening, I sat on the kitchen floor while Sophie slept upstairs. I cried until my face hurt. Then I looked at my daughter's school picture on the refrigerator, and something inside me changed. I whispered, "I'm done begging people to believe me." Next morning, I hired an attorney. For the first time, I stopped explaining myself to everyone. I stopped answering family messages. I stopped defending myself on social media, and I started collecting facts. My attorney told me not to confront Vanessa, so I didn't. Instead, I documented everything. I requested copies of financial records through proper channels. I preserved emails. I saved messages. I made a timeline of every transaction I had questioned. Then I remembered something: Northfield Solutions. I asked my attorney to investigate the company through public business records. 3 days later, she called me. "Camille, you need to sit down." I sat down. Northfield Solutions is registered to a man named Robert Harper. Heart stopped. "Who is Robert Harper?" She paused. "Your father." I couldn't breathe. My father had been telling everyone that he was ashamed of what I had done, but the company receiving money from Vanessa's boutique was registered to him. And then we found something even bigger. The bank records showed that the suspicious payments hadn't been going to my father's company directly. They had been routed through several accounts. But the final transfers went into an account connected to Vanessa. The money wasn't being stolen by me, it was being moved by them. And there was one more piece. The login records showed that my payroll credentials had been used from a laptop located inside Vanessa's home. I had never been there during those transactions. My attorney told me, "Don't contact them. Let the evidence speak." I waited. Weeks passed. Then came the moment none of them expected. Vanessa's second store began failing. The financial irregularities had triggered questions from her lender. Her bank wanted explanations. Her accountant discovered discrepancies. And suddenly the same people who had laughed at me weren't laughing anymore. One evening, Vanessa showed up at my townhouse. I opened the door. She looked exhausted. "Camille, please." I said nothing. She stepped closer. "We need to talk." "No, we don't." Her eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand what's happening." "I understand perfectly." She lowered her voice. "Help me." I almost laughed, not because I was happy, because I remembered sitting on that same floor weeks earlier believing my life was over. Now Vanessa was standing in my doorway asking me to save hers. "I can't do that," I said. She stared at me. "Why?" "Because you already told everyone who I was." She began crying. "You're my sister." I looked at her calmly. "And you accused me of stealing from you." She whispered I was wrong. "No," I shook my head. "You weren't wrong. You were willing to believe something terrible about me because it made your story easier." Then she said the words I never expected. Please don't give the records to the bank. I knew then that she understood exactly what was coming. The evidence was submitted through my attorney. The investigation cleared my name. My former employer reinstated me and apologized. Vanessa's business faced financial consequences for the transactions and false accusations. My father admitted that he had helped create Northfield Solutions. Kyle eventually confessed that he had used my credentials after Vanessa gave him access to her laptop. And Daniel, he asked me to forgive him. I didn't immediately. Some wounds don't disappear because someone says they're sorry. Months later, my life looked completely different. I kept my job, moved into a smaller apartment with Sophie, and started taking night classes in business accounting. I wasn't rich, I wasn't famous, I hadn't become some overnight success story. But I was finally building a life that didn't depend on people laughing at me or approving of me. One afternoon, I received a letter from Vanessa. She wrote that she had underestimated me. She said she was sorry. I read it once. Then I put it away. I didn't need her apology to feel powerful anymore. The strangest part was that everyone who once laughed at me eventually came back asking for mercy. But I learned something they never understood. Mercy doesn't mean allowing someone to hurt you again. Sometimes the strongest revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's becoming so secure in yourself that their opinion no longer has the power to destroy you. They laughed because they thought being quiet meant I was weak. They were wrong. I was quiet because I was listening. And when the truth finally spoke for me, I didn't have to laugh back. I just walked away.